Classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian or respondent conditioning because it was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist. In the previous video, we have seen that various learning theories are there, and classical conditioning comes under learning through association. Before going to the details, please remember to subscribe this channel. Thank you. Definition of classical conditioning. It is a type of learning in which an initially neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, when paired with a stimulus that elicits a reflex response, that is the unconditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is paired with unconditioned stimulus and it results in a learned or conditioned response. Or in other words, classical conditioning is the process by which a naturally occurring stimulus is paired with a stimulus in the environment. And as a result, the environmental stimulus eventually elicits the same response as the natural stimulus. With the example, you will be able to understand this easily. So, classical conditioning is a psychology concept and it involves associative learning. Specifically, it is a form of learning that shapes and modifies our behavior through association of stimuli. For example, consider as a child, you was encountered with a cat and the cat scratches you. Then you may develop a fear response to the cats. The cat is a neutral stimulus. It is presented right before the scratching. That is, the scratching is the unconditioned stimulus and it leads to a fear response, that is the unconditioned response. After some time, you may show a fear response whenever you see a cat. So that is a conditioned stimulus. Even if the cat is not scratched. So this is the classical conditioning. So once you get a scratch from a cat, you will have a fear response whenever you see a cat, even if it doesn't scratch you. Pavlov and conditioning. So we have learned that the classical conditioning is discovered by Ivan Pavlov. The most famous example of classical conditioning was Ivan Pavlov's experiments with the dogs. The dog salivated in response to a bell tone. Pavlov showed that when a bell was sounded each time the dog was fed, the dog learned to associate the sound with the presentation of the food. He first presented the dog with the sound of a bell. They did not salivate, so this was a neutral stimulus. Then he presented them with food. They salivated. The food was an unconditioned stimulus and salivation was an unconditioned response. He then repeatedly presented the dogs with the sound of the bell first and then the food. So he paired the stimulus, the bell, with another stimulus, food. After a few repetitions, the dogs salivated when they heard the sound of the bell. Earlier, the dog salivated when it saw the food, but when it was paired with the sound of bell, even hearing the bell sound, the dog salivated. It means that the dog had become conditioned with the bell. So that is classical conditioning of Ivan Pavlov. Types of stimuli and the responses. Each of the stimuli and responses in classical conditioning is referred to by specific term. In classical conditioning, neutral stimulus. is a stimulus that initially does not evoke a response until it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. In the Pavlov's example, the experiment, the bell was the neutral stimulus and only produced a response when it was paired with food. Before that, the dog didn't salivate. So, the bell is a neutral stimulus. In classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, it is a feature of the environment that causes a natural and automatic unconditioned response. In the Pavlov study, the unconditioned stimulus was food. It is a natural stimulus, right? The presentation of food to the dog, it is the unconditioned stimulus because the dog's response to the food occur naturally. Then, unconditioned response. It is an unlearned response that occurs automatically when the unconditioned stimulus is presented. In the experiment, Pavlov showed that the existence of the unconditioned response by presenting a dog with a bowl of food and measuring its salivary secretions or the saliva. Salivation in response to the food is called the unconditioned response because it's an innate reflex. It comes naturally. So that is the unconditioned response. That is the salivation in response to the food. And food is the unconditioned stimulus. That is a naturally occurring stimulus. Then conditioned stimulus. It makes an organism react to something because it is associated with something else. For example, in the experiment, Pavlov's dog, it learned to salivate at the sound of a bell. We know that as it is with a bell sound, the dog doesn't salivate. But when it is paired with the food, with the sound of bell, the dog salivated. The bell here is the conditioned stimulus. That is, the sound of the bell is conditioned or paired with the food. So, the dog must learn to associate it with the desired response. The conditioned response. It is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. So, the bell was previously a neutral stimulus and when it become conditioned stimulus, the response towards that stimulus is known as the conditioned response. In Pavlov's experiment, the salivation to the bell is the conditioned response because the dog learns to associate the response with the conditioned stimulus. So these are the stimulus and the responses in the classical conditioning experiment by Ivan Pavlov. So what happens during the classical conditioning? There are 3 stages of classical conditioning and at each stage the stimuli and the responses are given special scientific terms. In the stage 1, that is before the conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus have no relationship. The unconditioned stimuli come up in the environment and it naturally elicits a unconditioned response. That is, the food, it naturally elicits a response. That is, the dog will salivate seeing the food. And this doesn't have any relation or it is not paired with any neutral stimulus. The unconditioned response wasn't taught or it is not learned. Presenting food naturally and automatically triggers a salivation response. It is automatic and it is not learned. So, before conditioning, the food, it elicits a response and the bell, which is a neutral stimulus, it doesn't elicit any response. Now stage 2. This is the process of conditioning. During conditioning, what happens? The unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus, that is the food and the bell, they are paired, leading the previously neutral stimulus, that is the bell, to become a conditioned stimulus. So here the process of conditioning happens. The conditioned stimulus occur just before or at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus, and in the process the conditioned stimulus become associated with the unconditioned stimulus, that is the bell become associated with the food and by extension the unconditioned response. Generally, the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus must be paired several times. That is, the food and the bell, it is paired several times in order to reinforce the association between these two stimuli. For example, when the dog hear the bell and then they are presented with food, they unconsciously form a connection between the two stimuli. The neutral stimuli, the bell, it evolves into a conditioned stimulus. The dog now responds to the bell in the same way they did when given food, because they view bell as part of the process. So this process happens during the conditioning. Now stage 3. What happens after the conditioning? Once the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, that is the food and the bell, have been associated, the bell will trigger a response without the need to present food with it. The conditioned stimulus, that is the bell, now elicits a conditioned response. The individual, that is the dog, has learned to associate a specific response with a previously neutral stimulus. That is, the bell was previously a neutral stimulus and the dog now learned to elicit a response while hearing the bell sound. That is, once the conditioning has occurred and the association is made between the unconditioned and the conditioned stimulus, that is the food and the bell, the unconditioned stimulus, that is the food, can be removed from the equation entirely and the response will be the same. That is, without providing the food, even just hearing the sound of the bell, the dog will elicit a response. That is, the dog will salivate. That is, a response is now triggered by using the conditioned stimulus by itself. In the experiment, the dog salivated at hearing only the sound of bell because they associated it with getting fed. Now let's see the importance of classical conditioning. There are many areas in which classical conditioning is used today, including in mental health treatment, education, pet training, etc. Classical conditioning is important because it is a basic form of learning. It shapes the behavior of humans and the animals. Research has shown that classical conditioning principles, it become helpful in treating the anxiety, depression, phobias, panic disorders, substance use disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, etc. The therapist, for example, repeatedly pair something that provokes anxiety with relaxation techniques in order to create an association. Then, teachers at classrooms can apply classical conditioning by creating a positive classroom environment to help the students overcome their anxiety or fear. Pairing an anxiety-provoking situation, such as performing in front of a group, with pleasant surroundings, it helps the student learn new associations. Instead of feeling anxious and tense in the situation, the child will learn to stay relaxed and calm. Then, behavioral therapists, they use the principle of classical conditioning to help people change their negative behaviors. The thought behind these therapies is that we learn from our environment. Cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy are two types of behavioral therapies. And the classical conditioning is used in pet training. It is a highly popular tool used to train pets to be more obedient. It is performed to assist your dog in unconsciously engaging in good behavior. So these are the importance of classical conditioning. Now let's have a quick recap on what we have learned. We have learned the definition of the classical conditioning. So it is a psychology concept and it involves associative learning. Then we have learned the experiment of Ivan Pavlov, various stimulus and the responses. Then the stages of classical conditioning. Before, how was it? During the process, what happens? And after the classical conditioning, what happens? We have learned that. And the importance of the classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is often considered the most important discovery in the history of psychology because it forms the basis of behavioral psychology. It can be used in a variety of different ways. So, hope you like this video on classical conditioning. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you and keep smiling.